Arlington today, with its new ballpark, modern city hall, library, Six Flags, Hurricane Harbor, industrial district, and other new developments, may give a visitor or even a new resident the impression that it was established around 1970, sort of an outgrowth of Dallas and Fort Worth. Old-timers know better, of course, but outside of a few cemeteries and historical markers, there's little to suggest that the Arlington area was settled first, and Dallas and Fort Worth grew up around it, well, as our rather large suburbs. Part of the reason is the spectacular growth sustained by Arlington in the past few years, growth that has obscured much of its past and erased many of its landmarks. Now, our purpose here is to present an overview of a history of Arlington from trading post to wrecking ball, to keep you in touch with its roots and seek your help in preserving what's left in the way of photographs, records, documents, and landmarks. Artifacts found in the Arlington area show that it's been occupied for several thousand years, primarily because of its location. It has a river, creeks, trees, arable land, a temperate climate with sufficient rainfall to grow crops, and in earlier times, bubbling springs and enough game to feed a large number of people. Indians lived throughout the area, but were concentrated mainly along Village Creek, where three large villages gave the creek its name. They were members of the Caddo tribe, and they preferred the creek to the river because of the Trinity's frequent floods. Spanish explorers passing through the area in 1536 noted that the Indians were fairly peaceful and that they grew corn. Explorers, hunters, and traders from the United States passed through the region, which became known as the Cross Timbers. Indians were the dominant force here until shortly after Texas won its independence from Mexico in 1836. One of the earliest settlers was Major Jonathan Byrd, who built a fort here in 1841, just north of the Trinity at an oxbow lake now called Callaway's Lake, and he brought in half a dozen families to start a settlement. The Indians, however, harassed them by burning the fields around the fort and attacking small parties who ventured out in search of food. In retaliation for the harassment, General Tarrant led a group of militia against the Indians along Village Creek, and 12 Indians were killed and one white man, Captain John B. Denton. After the attack, the Indians moved out permanently. The Battle of Village Creek is memorialized by a stone monument along Highway 303 on the north side just past the creek. Then in 1842, the land around Bird's Fort came under the Peters Colony Grant, and the settlers had to move. Most of them joined the J.N. Bryan settlement in present-day Dallas. Sam Houston, by then President of the Republic of Texas, sought to end the friction between the settlers and the Indians by holding a series of meetings with the Indians at Bird's Fort and Marrowbone Springs, and this was known as the Great Indian Council. Accounts as to the number of Indians who showed up varies from around 1,000 to a few hundred, but all agree there were plenty of tribal chiefs and leaders who smoked the peace pipe with Houston's representatives, Generals Tarrant and Terrell. Now, Houston's goal was to keep the settlers and the Indians separated by a string of trading posts and forts across the whole state. Following the Indian Council, Trading Post Number 1 was officially established at Marrowbone Springs in 1844. Marrowbone Springs is located near the intersection of Matlock Road and Arkansas Lane, there in Founders Park. Colonel Middleton Tate Johnson, a friend of Houston's, was commissioned to establish a ranger post and camp at or near Marrowbone Springs, which became known as Johnson's Ranger Station. And in 1852, Colonel Johnson bought the trading post and the land surrounding it, built the Johnson Plantation House, and brought in 80 slaves to plant, grow, and harvest cotton. The plantation house served as a stagecoach stop on the overland stage route from Dallas to Fort Worth to Austin. And it also served as a way station for gold seekers traveling to California. California Lane got its name from being a part of that route. Part of the old stagecoach roadbed is still evident in the Johnson Station Cemetery. The wagon wheel ruts were filled in a few years ago, but the depression in the land remains. A village soon grew up around Johnson Plantation, known simply as Johnson Station. Shortly afterwards, other communities began to develop throughout the area. Watson to the north, Hyderville to the northeast, Sublette, Webb, and others to the south and southeast. Now, each community had its own churches and school, and the schools were usually box-like affairs, such as this one at Johnson Station. Smaller communities only had one-room schools. But the educations received were well within frontier standards and produced a number of scholars and teachers because principals like Mr. O.J. Lawrence ran a tight, no-nonsense curriculum. Soon the area began to prosper. Log cabins gave way to larger family farmhouses. Transportation was supplied by horse and buggy or horseback. Water was supplied by wells and later windmills and storage tanks. And fuel was supplied by the many trees in the creek and river bottoms. Recreation at that time consisted of sliding down haystacks, wading in Johnson Creek, and lawn tennis. Now, according to an article in the Herald, which was the local paper at that time, the most recent costume being worn for this sport is quite natty. The skirts are a few inches from the ground, and the undergarments worn with them fastened just below the knee. But the main form of recreation was neighbor get-togethers like this one at the Barden Farm to talk about crops, the weather, or have a barn dance or a quilting bee for the ladies. Cotton was the primary crop, and the black land in the southern part of the area yielded almost a bale to the acre. The problem was getting it to market. You had to depend on freight wagons, and this was expensive. The freight problem was solved in 1876 when the T&P Railway began a survey for a railroad between Dallas and Fort Worth. They contacted the Reverend Hyder, who was also a surveyor, as to the best route. The site selected was about 2 miles north of Johnson Station. Then Reverend Hyder surveyed a 4-square-block parcel of land just south of the proposed depot site, which became the intersection of Main and Center Streets. These are the first 3 stores on Main Street. Neither store owner and postmaster Jim Ditto, nor the Reverend Hyder wanted to call the new site Hyderville. Some wanted to call it Johnson City, but others felt this would be confusing because of the closeness of Johnson Station. So they decided to name it Arlington after Robert E. Lee's residence in Virginia. And in 1876, locomotive number 20 rolled into Arlington. The depot and loading dock assured Arlington area farmers of a way to market and merchants a steady supply of merchandise. The importance of the railroad to Arlington was brought home in 1885 when the wooden trestle over Village Creek, weakened by flood, collapsed, dropping engine number 642 into the creek where it lies buried to this day. And when engine number 356 rammed into the rear of another train, it brought the natives out to inspect the damage. Some in their Sunday best, and it probably put the freight wagons back in business for a while. But the main contribution of the railroad was that it made Arlington the center of commerce and industry for the surrounding communities. Cotton gin equipment was shipped in, and at one time there were 5 gins in operation. A grist mill was constructed on the Trinity and operated by R.A. Randall. The original 4-block area surveyed by Hyder was rapidly filled by stores of all kinds. A general store, the Rose Cafe, and the Rose and Mitchell real estate office, which was typical of the time. However, what went on inside was not. They hired the first female secretary ever in downtown Arlington. Eyebrows were raised, gossip was rampant. Could you imagine a woman in the workplace? Next, the downtown area expanded to the west, east, and south with horse and mule traders, a lumber yard, the Arlington Hotel, owned by A.J. and Carrie Rogers, a millinery shop, and other essential businesses. To provide a water supply for the town, a well was dug at the intersection of Main and Center, right in the middle of the intersection. For many years, the mineral well was the premier landmark in Arlington. The water, however, tasted like a mixture of sulfur and ipecac. Enterprising citizens took a page from P.T. Barnum and started marketing the minerals as a cure for what ailed you, much better than snake oil. Political speeches were made from the well. Ladies from the Temperance League marched around it. Bond rallies, high school and college pep rallies were held around it. And being in the middle of the street, everybody drove around it. The water from it was sold until the 50s, when the feds said we couldn't prove that it was beneficial. They didn't seem to realize that anything that tasted that bad had to be good for you. So the well was dismantled. All that was left was a concrete ring in the middle of the intersection, but that stayed until the rest of downtown disappeared. As Arlington and surrounding communities prospered, attention shifted toward the need for an institution that would qualify students for higher learning. Edward Rankin, owner of a hardware store, and Tom Ditto, grocery store owner, put together enough backers to open Arlington College, a prep school. Fish Hall was built to house a number of students, but it had no running water and consequently no plumbing. Later, a noted educator named Carlisle bought the college and changed it into a military school for boys known as Carlisle Military Academy. And from that point, the college went through a number of name and curriculum changes, such as Grubbs Vocational College, INTAC, or North Texas Agricultural College, Arlington State College, and finally, University of Texas at Arlington, with over 25,000 students. By the turn of the century, Arlington had running water, telephone lines were installed, and the electric company had brought in power lines for both an interurban and the town. The interurban had a significant impact on the whole area. A buggy ride to Fort Worth or Dallas could use up most of the day just getting there and back. The interurban could make it in less than an hour. The tracks came through on Abram Street before it was paved. It allowed the ladies a wider shopping horizon. Dallas and Fort Worth stores, just wait in the yard, and there they were. The interurban improved access to recreational facilities. Arlington families used it for weekend outings at Handley's, Lake Erie, for boating, swimming, picnicking, and other outdoor pleasures. Remnants of the old interurban right-of-way can still be seen alongside the railroad tracks in western Arlington. By the early 1900s, downtown Arlington had reached the limits of its growth. This street scene taken in 1910 is not that much different than one taken 50 years later. Storefronts changed, buildings were remodeled, and during that 50 years, any particular building may have been a hardware store, grocery store, barber shop, or all of the above, but the town configuration remained the same. As downtown remained static, so did the rest of Arlington. From 1928 to the 1950s, the city limits did not change. There were, however, a number of changes going on. Farms were beginning to use mechanized equipment here and throughout the U.S., resulting in a general decline in the market for local farm products. Mechanized farming also meant that large families were no longer needed to run the farm, and this sent family members in search of work elsewhere. The automobile was being mass-produced, which gave unneeded farm labor the means to get to distant work sites or to public transportation sites, such as the interurban. There were some changes in the Arlington business community. Bicycle shops became auto shops. Auto supply stores were opened, or supplies were added to the inventory of hardware stores, and gas stations began to appear. The Masons built 2 retirement homes in Arlington, one on West Division for men, and the Eastern Star home for women on East Division. This is Joe Johnson. Joe was a local black contractor, and here he is putting the finishing touches on the landscaping at the Eastern Star home. Major industries began looking at Arlington and its excellent location, and it was this point in Arlington's development that the citizens, through their elected representatives, had to make a choice whether to encourage outside industry to move in or continue in its traditional role of small, quiet township, supplying goods and services to surrounding communities. A fact sheet written by W.H. Rose, mayor of Arlington from 1919 to 1923, sheds light on Arlington's decision. It began with an outline of the town's virtues, and he noted its churches, and although he didn't mention them individually, at that time there was the Methodist, the First Baptist, the First Presbyterian, the First Christian, and Mount Olive, the black church that served the community on the hill. He noted that each one exerted a great deal of influence over its congregation and collectively the whole community. Baptisms at that time were held in local tanks and creeks, such as this one at Village Creek, although Johnson Creek came in for its share. Mayor Rose also noted that its 2 schools, a grade school on the north side of the tracks and a combined grade school and high school on the south side, were affiliated with the University of Texas, and that a new high school was being constructed near the corner of Cooper and Abram Streets. This is the Arlington High graduating class of 1924. It had an equal number of boys and girls, and it was the second class to graduate from the new building. The area also produced its share of athletes. This is the 1922 county champion girls basketball team from Johnson Station, and the 1923 Arlington High county champion baseball team. Rose listed the paved road from Fort Worth to Dallas, called the Bankhead National Highway, which we know today as Division Street, or old Highway 80, as another asset, and he noted there were also a number of graveled side roads to accommodate personal vehicles for country drives and Sunday outings, and that Arlington had all the facilities of a major city: telephone, water, electricity, and a sewage system. Then Mayor Rose makes a statement that seems to set the tone for Arlington for the next 40 years. We are catering to the home seeker, the best people of Dallas and Fort Worth, and other good people who want to make Arlington their hometown. Thus, the shift to a bedroom community, which remained in effect until the early 50s. Many of the old-timers still think of this period as the golden age of Arlington. During the 30s, Arlington took its first step in commercial entertainment when the Wagner family put in a racetrack east of town at the 3D Stock Farm, and this was known as Arlington Downs. For several years, it was a going concern. It caused some expansion, brought in tourists, created some area jobs, and provided seasonal entertainment until the legislature voted it out of existence. Aside from local merchants, about the only industry in town was the Southern Ornamental Iron Works, which was located where the Ott Cribs police station is now, near the corner of Division and Cooper. Most people work somewhere else, like the bomber plant in Fort Worth, where they built the B-24 bomber, with the help of some of Arlington's rosy riveters. Or North American in Grand Prairie, where they built the P-51 fighters. And when the interurban was phased out, the Texas Motor Coach supplied public transportation to Fort Worth, Dallas, and points in between. We've already noted that the old-timers call this period the Golden Age of Arlington. So what was it like growing up here during this time? Today, the kids talk about hanging out. Don't remember what we called it, but the most favored gathering spot was Terry Brothers Drugstore on the northeast corner of Main and Center, about where the main library parking lot is today. And the most favored seat was the Coke box in front. You could sit here and watch the coming and going of the whole town. And sometimes the seat got coeducational. It was also a good spot to hitch a ride home at night or hook up with someone headed for the movie houses in Fort Worth. If you wanted something to eat, you could get a burger at the Workman Drugstore across the street. This was another favored hangout, and they also made the best root beer milkshakes in town. Coulter's Drug was on the northwest corner, and this is the head soda jerk, ready to usher customers inside for any one of the numerous specialities he could conjure up. If you were nearly broke, you could get a Coke and a hamburger for 15 cents at the Rockefeller. That's the little building there in the middle. If you were totally broke, you could go next door to the Arlington coffee shop and get a chicken fried steak and sign the check, which you better take care of at payday. If you got back to town late, now that's a relative term because late meant any time after dark. You could always get a cup of coffee or a full breakfast at the Rainbow Grill, an all-night restaurant, located in the Cooper Hotel at the corner of Center and Division Streets. Now that's the hotel in the background. It's now a pawn shop. Dinner, dancing, and the various banquets and high school proms were held at the Midway Inn, about 2 miles west of town on Highway 80. There were 2 movie theaters in town, the Texan shown here, and the Aggie, a block further east on Main Street. And much to the chagrin of the local mothers, a pool hall right here in River City, Albert Austin's Emporium. On a more positive note, there were organizations such as the Rainbow Girls and the D-Malays. This group is from 1947. The Rainbows met once a month in the hall over Terry's Drug, and this is an installation of officers in 1947. The D-Malays and Rainbows held a jointly sponsored dance once or twice a year, which was always well attended. Back then, dancing was considered a contact sport. The social graces were taught at the Bennett School of Fine Arts, where music and dance instruction topped the list. A number of Arlington's leading citizens began their careers from this vantage point. On the back row, second from left, is Dorothy Thornton Rencorell. Third from left, Betty Evans Parr. Fourth from left, James Cribbs. And Dan Reynolds seated second from left. There were 3 scout troops in town. Troop 53, sponsored by First Presbyterian Church, Scoutmaster Reeford Houston. Troop 57, sponsored by First Baptist Church, Scoutmaster was Earl D. Scott. And Troop 68, sponsored by First Methodist Church, Scoutmaster Boyd Lawson. The highlight of scouting each year was the camp out at Worth Ranch. Only problem, lots of Tarzans and no Janes. Quite a few of our activities centered around high school, where we all came together from surrounding communities of Webb, Sublette, Pantago, Johnson Station, Watson, and Northside and Southside schools. Northside was known as John A. Cookin with grades 1 through 8, and this is the Northside graduating class of 1946. Southside had more students and had an excellent choir led by Jane Ellis. By the late 40s, Arlington High had a uniform band again, right here in River City, thanks to the efforts of the Vandegrift's and Dean Corey. The whole town turned out for our high school football games and gave us full support, win or lose. And all home games were followed by a dance in the gym. The 1951 season ended with a state football championship. Aside from athletics, there were a couple of other organizations that had a lot of influence on the young people. The FHA, or Future Homemakers of America, which taught girls how to cook, sew, and manage a household. After they passed an initiation ceremony where they wore pigtails, carried a doll all day, and at lunch played Ring Around the Rosie around the flagpole. And also they were forbidden to speak to a boy all day. The other group was the FFA, or Future Farmers of America, which taught boys how to raise livestock, grow plants, and handle tools. I don't think many of them became farmers, but the experience no doubt came in handy for solving some of the honeydews associated with keeping a house and grounds in good repair. There was plenty of livestock within a few blocks of town, and horseback riding was a favorite pastime. Summer activities centered around Meadowbrook Park. It was an excellent place for a family outing. Picnic in the park, wait an hour, then head for the pool and dive in. This is the lifeguard whom we all envied because he got to test the water before the pool opened. But we envied him mainly because once it did, all the girls flocked around him. Now, this is part of the workman family, beating the heat. Nobody had much in the way of air conditioning. And this was about the coolest place to be in August. After supper, we'd return to the park, to the ball field, and watch the Vandegrift softball team whoop up on the out-of-towners. By the early 50s, the idea of a bedroom community had about run its course. Hanley, as a township, had disappeared, swallowed by an expanding Fort Worth. On the eastern front, Grand Prairie was being pushed at us by an expanding Dallas, and it didn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that if Arlington didn't do something about it, we'd be bounded permanently by Randall Mill, Park Row, Collins, and Fielder Road. Thus, Arlington entered a period of expansion, in some cases reluctantly, but with the primary motive of continuing to serve our surrounding communities. It began with the election of Tom Vandegrift as mayor, a young man of energy, enterprise, and a vision of Arlington's potential contribution to the Metroplex. One of his first acts as mayor was to do everything possible to make sure that Arlington was selected as the site for a new General Motors assembly plant. His success in bringing the plant to Arlington created numerous jobs for the local workforce and also expanded the housing market and mercantile opportunities, and it gave the minority community much better job opportunities. And it set the stage for a round of annexations. The red area is the city limits from the 1920s to the 1950s. The yellow area was annexed in the 1950s. The dark green area was annexed in the 1960s. The blue area was annexed in the 1970s, and the pink area was annexed in the 1980s. The end result was the incorporation of the surrounding communities into Greater Arlington. A goal from the outset of the expansion policy, Arlington had served these communities from the beginning and would now continue to do so. However, from the perspective of historical preservation, the rapid expansion created a large number of historical casualties. Rural Hudspeth captured these shots just before the wrecking ball and bulldozers began their work. This is looking west down Main Street from Main and Mesquite. This is looking east up Main Street from the post office. This is looking north on Center Street from Abram. This is looking south on Center Street from Main. Dismantling began with Schrickle Hall and moved throughout the two eastern blocks to make way for a new library. When it was completed, the crews began dismantling the two western blocks. The old bank building came down completely. The Texan Theater building, which had also housed a bank and a library, was next. Then Rockefeller's. I call this shot the last of the 10-cent hamburgers. The coffee shop and the old city hall, along with the rest of the two western blocks, were torn down and graded over to make way for a new city hall. But until they got it put up, it gave one kind of an eerie feeling to stand on Abram Street and see all the way through to the Arlington Theater. Anyway, the debris was hauled to the area where Pecan Street intersects with Park Row as landfill material for the W.O. Workman Housing Development Project. Now, you tell someone who's moved here in the past 35 years that you're going downtown, and you either get a blank look or, oh, where's that? Unfortunately, the whole town is beginning to look like it was built during the 60s and 70s as other landmarks continue to disappear. The Hood home on the corner of Front and Mesquite fell into such a state of disrepair that it had to be torn down. The Old Moore Funeral Building survived for a while as a used car office, but burned to the ground a few years ago. The Cooper House, once the home of one of Arlington's earliest settlers and a replica of Robert E. Lee's residence in Virginia, was donated to the city. It was to be preserved by moving it down Abram Street to Meadowbrook Park, where it became the city library and later home of the Women's Club, until it was burned by vandals and had to be completely demolished. Thanks to certain individuals in town and the Arlington Historical Society, there have been some successes. Photographs of Arlington's history have been preserved by individuals like J.W. Dunlop, who placed a large display in the Fielder Museum, and Truman Bryce, Martha Martin, Dorothy Thornton Wren-Correll, Bill Barden, and others who have donated pictures to the Fielder Museum Library and the UTA Special Collections. The city has preserved the Fielder House, now used by the Arlington Historical Society. Individuals have also been successful in preserving some structures. The Thornton Sisters House on West Abram has been restored and well maintained by a fraternity, as has the old Vault House across the street. Although no longer owned by a fraternity, it's been refurbished again by Xavier Carrillo. Mayor Barnes' house has also been restored by Mr. Carrillo. And this photo was taken as the Thornton House on East Abram was undergoing restoration, which has now been completed. Chris Rumans got the Old Town District on the north side put on the National Register of Historic Places. The Arlington Historical Society moved several landmark cabins to the Johnson Cemetery. And in 2004, they moved the cabins to Knapp Heritage Park, where they'll be more visible and available for tours. Another group making headway is the Landmark Preservation Commission, which has succeeded in getting markers for the Pioneer Trail, as well as markers along Village Creek. They placed the old Main Street Post Office on the National Register of Historic Landmarks, along with the South Center Street Historic District. They have completed a survey of all houses in Arlington, 50 years and older, so that they could be notified when a demolition permit is issued for a house on the list, thus hopefully giving us a chance to provide an alternate solution, such as restoration or getting the house moved, as Martha Martin did with this one. The Downtown Arlington Management Corporation is an organization seeking to reestablish the prominence of the downtown area through promoting construction of new buildings and revitalization of older ones. Their first project is bordered by Center, Mesquite, Division, and Front Streets, and its parking lot contains a recreation of the historic Old Well. Another group, the Arlington Preservation Foundation, which is currently responsible for this film, has a historical marker program which has so far placed markers at the Top of Hill Terrace Tea Garden, Slaughter's house on South Center. Slaughter was a noted old-time Arlington businessman. The Laughlin Farmstead, and the Knapp Heritage Park. Owners of additional sites and buildings are currently being contacted, and we hope our marker program, this film, and other ongoing historical preservation activities will help preserve what's left of our history.